Rare protests against the government are sweeping Egypt. Thousands have rallied in towns and cities, demanding that the president resigns. A tough security crackdown has been launched, and yet people are not giving up. But can the protesters achieve lasting political change? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Rob Matheson. Welcome to the program. President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has to go. That's the call being made in rare protests against the leadership in Egypt. Friday was dubbed a day of rage, in which one protester was killed and several were arrested. Giza has been the epicenter since demonstrations began on September the 20th. Security personnel have been deployed there in force. In Damietta, police with guns faced off with dozens of demonstrators before charging at the crowd. 10 people were arrested. Another 4 were detained in the southern city of Luxor. And in Cairo's Helwan neighborhood, people chanted, "Say it out loud, don't be scared, el-Sisi has got to go." Well, the protests reignited on the anniversary of last year's mass rallies. There's anger over President Sisi's decision to demolish thousands of homes the government says were built illegally. Some of the poorest communities are affected. 70% of Egyptians are estimated to be living on the poverty line, and coronavirus lockdowns have made their situation worse. The protests are the biggest held since 2019, when video messages from Egyptian businessman Mohamed Ali inspired similar rallies. He says Sisi and his allies spend public money building themselves luxury homes. Sisi banned unauthorized protests when he took power in a military coup in 2013. But the biggest wave of arrests has been in 2019. Amnesty International says at least 4,000 people were detained. Well, Mohamed Ali has released more video messages in support of the protesters. He's urging people to stay on the streets until the president resigns.
Egyptians unite. Out of love for the Egyptian people, take back your country again. Don't leave it in el-Sisi's hands. Down with the Sisi regime. Down with the Sisi regime. Don't go home. Do not go home. If we go home, they will detain us. Don't go home. We're in the streets, and now we need to stay there.
Well, let's bring in our guests in Berlin. Ahmed Said is a former political prisoner and the coordinator for the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms in Germany. In Newark, Sahar Aziz is a professor of law at Rutgers University and director of the Center for Security, Race and Rights. And in Boston, Timothy Kaldas is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Welcome, all of you, to the program. I want to start with Ahmed Said. How significant is it, do you think, that given the security crackdowns that we have seen over the last couple of years when it's come to protests, that these protesters do seem to be prepared to take the risk of being arrested, at the very least in order to make their voices heard?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I think that what are we watching right now in Egypt is a very significant sign to which indicating that the state of fear that the Egyptian regime has already established since 2013 is not working very well for the sake of the Egyptian regime, is not bringing the stability that the Egyptian regime promised his partners, his Western partners, which supported him in the last 7 years with the political argument that they have been using all the time, that this regime is the only option that will bring stability for Egypt. And it's saying that these protests, is saying that there could not be any kind of stability under this oppressive regime. And from my point of view, I think that the Egyptian people kept trying to break through this wall of fear during the last 7 years. They didn't have stopped doing this it has been always this kind of a small protests. Like, let's give an example. Like, just a couple of days before the 20th of September, there were already a protest in Duweka, and this protest was already have been happening for quite a long time right now. And it's all like an equation between the anger and frustration which the Egyptian people are living and experiencing for years right now, and compare in comparison with the fear that they are living also, when the frustration and anger becoming just more exceeding the limitations of fear, happening what we are watching right now. And I think it would continue as long as we have this dictatorship or authoritarian regime in Egypt.
Sahar, Aziz, we were talking earlier about the fact that this was principally or sparked by the fact that President Sisi has this policy of demolishing thousands of illegally built homes, as they call them. Is that the only issue here? Are we talking about a wider range of issues that people are angry about?
You have to ask yourself, why are Egyptians protesting? So Egyptians as a people, if we had to generalize, are not known for protesting for the heck of it. I think they proved to the world and to the country that they value stability, political stability. They don't like chaos, and to the extent that they were willing to sacrifice the revolution for it when millions of them supported Sisi overthrowing a democratically elected government under the Morsi regime. So Egyptians, when they protest, it usually represents very deep-seated, authentic grievances. And what we're seeing with these latest rounds of protests is that the grievances are growing. And I think this is Sisi's essential problem, is that he is proving to be a poor governor. And because what he's doing, and he's perpetuating two Egypts. There's always been two Egypts. There's been the Egypt for the haves and Egypt for the have-nots. Now, the past 7 or 8 years, the have-nots have grown tremendously, with the poverty rate going from 25% to 33% since the revolution. So more and more Egyptians are struggling to eat, literally. And now when you add 2 million constructions that are being threatened to be demolished if already poor people can't pay what they call reconciliation on a per square footage, then you are just adding to these grievances. So the protests signify dissatisfaction with governance, but they will also likely tie into a feeling of repression, that not only are we being impoverished, but we also don't even have the political space to try to complain about it, to try to fix it, to try to engage with our regime. And the response of the Sisi regime is what a typical military government will do: crack down. Militaries are not trained in the art of governance. They are trained in the art of security, which is a zero-sum game, a black and white paradigm. And so I think the military is just digging its own grave in the long run in terms of its legitimacy. And the real concern is what lies ahead for Egypt, because even if he quashes these protests, the underlying grievances are still there and they're deepening.
Timothy Kaldas, the government and outside observers, people who study Egypt closely, and the media as well, ourselves included, seem to have been caught somewhat unawares by these protests, even though we have had small-scale sporadic protests up to this point. Has the Egyptian government and the military become complacent?
I think that they haven't been caught flat-footed. I mean, they were anticipating the likelihood of protests, and there were arrests in the lead up to these protests and increased security presence in anticipation of the possibility of protests, as this comes on the anniversary of the protests sparked by Mohamed Ali's revelations September of last year. So I think that they're aware of this issue. There's definitely a sense that there is growing tension. There's also sensitivity around the role of security companies owned by the security agencies, particularly the military. We've seen them go out of their way to deny that the military is involved in certain business ventures, recognizing that increasingly the public is dissatisfied with them accumulating wealth while poverty levels, as was noted, are growing. So I think that they're aware of the issue. The question is, are they prepared to make the changes necessary to address the issue? And that's where we see a lot less happening. There's continued provocation with increased cost of transportation, this new effort to crack down on informal housing. And also the way that they've chosen to crack down on informal housing reflects a fundamental problem, which is that they want power without responsibility. In a police state where you can't hold a sign in Tahrir Square for 20, 30 minutes without getting arrested, for a protest sign, it's completely untenable that millions of structures were erected without some sort of official complicity. These aren't, and the informal housing in Egypt, a lot of it isn't what some might imagine as some sort of, structure that's some sort of shanty or something like that. We're talking about 10, 11-story buildings. And so the construction of these structures required officials to be complicit. Undoubtedly, bribery was involved. And so going after the civilians without addressing the government's role in all of this also reflects a fundamental problem and a fundamental degree of corruption in the manner in which this is being handled, which further provokes the population.
I want to come on to the role of the government and the military in a moment. But Ahmed, Timothy was just talking there about the influence of Mohamed Ali. Now, we should refer to the fact that Mohamed Ali is a former military contractor. He's now living in exile. He's been very critical of corruption, as he sees it, in the government. And he has been driving, at least in part, the protests that have been happening in Egypt. Now, my understanding was always that change was always expected to come from within Egypt, but these protests are being driven by somebody outside the country. How significant is that?
Actually, it's the change coming from within Egypt. I think we all or let's talk about myself. I believe also that the change will come within Egypt and from Egypt itself, but the reality saying that there is no space at all for any kind of political movement or political activities inside Egypt, no space at all. Even the social media, which has been used before by the Egyptian activists, became already very dangerous. They are following the activists on social media, on internet in general. So there's no space even for discussion of or building a ground or building a movement or trying to have a real connections with the people on the street. And actually, this is also a cause why many of the Egyptian activists are very skeptical about these calls coming from outside Egypt. Some of them having an ethical problem with it, that how can you being safe outside Egypt and just endangering people's lives and call them to go to talk to the street, which is very dangerous in Egypt right now, regarding the strategy and how the Egyptian regime is reacting to any kind of opposition or even just expression of a different point of view or discourse that other than what the Egyptian regime is adopting. So this kind of a problem, and also to see how the protest is unorganized. There's no one representing the movement in Egypt right now, or the protest right now. There's no so many of the people seeing no future, or like I'm talking about the near future of this protest right now. It will be just like what happened last year and what happened before, some days of protesting, thousands of people who will be arrested or forcibly disappeared, and so on. But there will not be real impact on the political reality in Egypt. But also from another perspective, we're seeing it as just something we can build on, something which indicate the feeling of the Egyptians, indicator of how the Sisi lost completely his popularity in Egypt, that what he built already during 2013 and then with the coup. And so the regime has no base at all right now in Egypt, and we can see this all the time. The Egyptian, I'm just want to add also something about why the Egyptians are moving right now, despite all of this security predominance in Egypt. The Egyptian regime has launched really a dirty war on the Egyptian opposition, all kind of opposition, and now in this time the danger of a Sisi becoming more visible to the normal people who are not politicized when it comes to their economical life and economic situation, and especially with the corona crisis and after, which we are still living. And then come this thing with the illegal constructions and this campaign. They began to demolish all the what called illegal constructions in Egypt. I think that's a very strong trigger to the people, because they are now facing a real danger, risking their real daily life. So
Ahmed, I want to forgive me for interrupting, because I want to bring in Timothy at that point, because Timothy, I saw you nodding through that, particularly the point where you said that, where Ahmed was saying that this was not necessarily going to lead to a regime change, but this was something to build on, and that President Sisi has, if I interpret what Ahmed was saying correctly, has essentially exposed himself too much, and now the people are seeing him exposed. Do you think that that's a fair comment?
I think that it's really difficult to dispute at this point that Sisi's popularity has deteriorated substantially from its peak in 2013 and 14. And that's largely a consequence of the deteriorating economic situation for most Egyptians, as Ahmed was pointing out. I think the unfortunate reality is that as poverty expands and people's standard of living declines, that people are losing faith in their leadership, which is a common reaction in any part of the world. And the fact that there is no mechanism for correcting the course in terms of real elections or even the ability to petition the government to alter its policies leaves people to either be silent or reach a breaking point and take to the streets and risk arrest or worse. And so that's this is a fairly predictable outcome. But I also agree with Ahmed's suspicion that at this time there isn't necessarily enough momentum to push this into a massive thing, but it's still really early to tell. I mean, last year, the protests happened on the 20th, and then there was massive repression, and there was a lot of anticipation for the following Friday, but really nothing happened. This year, we've had smaller protests, but we've had them now for several days, and people seeing people protest might feel encouraged to join. And I'm sure that's part of what the regime is worried about. And they're trying to balance not provoking a larger reaction with not allowing this to spin out of control. And that's not an easy balance to strike, especially as your popularity is deteriorating. You frankly don't have the financial resources to address the grievances of the public.
Sahar,
that's for an array of reasons. COVID I want to bring in that.
Forgive me for interrupting. Sahar, Aziz, I want to bring you in here because, again, you were nodding through all of that. But do you think that there is a point, given what Timothy was saying, that if the protests are directed towards President Sisi himself, that the military, by whom he is backed significantly, might feel that he has become a lame duck in a sense, that he is too much of a target, and they might actually abandon the president and allow him to fall as long as the actual regime itself can stay in place?
Well, this is the million-dollar question in Egypt, because I think most of us agree that the current regime is not sustainable, and it's really just when, not whether, it's going to change. Ideally, it would change through democratic elections, but that's clearly not going to be the case. And there was some concerns or some analysis that there could be an internal coup against Sisi, especially when Sami Annen was was nominating himself or running for the presidency the last time around, and instead he ended up in jail. And there has been some other concerns that there may be an internal coup. Now, unfortunately, even if there is a coup, that's not going to solve Egypt's problems, because you're just going to replace one military general with another, and the approach, the very harsh, repressive, anti-democratic approach, is going to stay the same corruption. And the difference is Egypt's always had a corruption problem. Its ranking is 105 out of 180 in Transparency International. But the issue is whether the corruption is getting worse as the economic conditions get worse as well, and also who are the beneficiaries of the corruption. And now that has shifted significantly to the military, which is going to make it even harder to switch a military-run government to a civilian-run government, because now you have people who are benefiting from the status quo. The other issue that is still uncertain, especially as we face new elections in the United States, is the role of international relations. One of the reasons I think Sisi has been able to go to the extreme in terms of his repression of the political space is because he's had almost no opposition or pressure externally. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates support him, and they continue to provide foreign aid. Israel supports him, and Trump supports him. So if Biden, for example, were to get elected, and if the Senate were to become dominated by the Democrats, and the Congress is already, or the U.S. House of Representatives, there may be more pressure internationally led by the U.S. with Europe working with them. Now that is, I realize, somewhat idealistic, but Egypt historically has always responded to international pressure, particularly from the U.S., not to the extent that it is transitioning into a democracy. And I don't take the position that the U.S. wants Egypt to be a full democracy, but I do think that there are influential advocates and stakeholders and interest groups in the U.S. that are successful in pressuring the U.S. government to at least mitigate and restrain some of the political oppression that's been going on in Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries. So again, the future in the U.S. and then the future of the military's sustainability as a government is up in the air. And worst case scenario is mass revolt that leads to live bullet shooting, that leads to a massive revolution that could become a domino effect in other countries who also have not successfully overthrown their repressive regimes under the so-called Arab Spring.
Timothy, I want to end with you. Given the fact what Ahmed was saying about the lack of organization that there has been with these particular protests, do you think that the only way that these protests will ultimately achieve a significant goal in Egypt would be if there was some sort of organization behind it? And if there was, what do you think that would have to be?
I think that it's really difficult to foresee what the pathway is to true revolutionary change. I mean, as Sahar noted, the most likely scenario is that there will be internal machinations and a regime, and the regime will choose a new leader if at some point in the future they determine that Sisi has outstayed his use. That I don't think is coming anytime soon, for the record. For the reasons outlined, he has been very successful at consolidating his power and rewarding those who support him handsomely. And I don't see him having any serious internal challenges. And externally, there's no foreseeable organization, and that's by design, of course. They have been very effective at crushing any effort to develop any sort of organization in opposition to the government. They arrest people for deigning to consider running for parliament under their very rigged system, such as Ziad al-Alemi. And so we have this situation where it's become very difficult, and they have successfully forced the opposition either into exile, into prison, into silence, or a number of them have been killed. I mean, and so the question is, where will opposition come from? And in the interim, it seems most likely that it'll come in these sporadic outbursts of protests, and whether or not they gain enough momentum to really threaten the stability of the ruling order, it remains to be seen.
Well, we're going to leave it there.
We don't have indications of that.
We're going to leave it there. Timothy Kaldas, thank you very much indeed. I want to say thank you to all our guests, Ahmed Said in Berlin, Sahar Aziz in Newark, and Timothy Kaldas in Boston. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rob Matheson, and the whole team here. Bye for now.